Welcome to Trust Talks and Digital Dives, where we delve into the world of trust in the digital age. Trust Talks and Digital Dives is produced by DIAC, a nonprofit organization that fosters secure and privacy-enhancing access to digital services in Canada and globally. Whether you're navigating the complexities of data privacy, pondering the impact of AI on trust, or curious about how technology shapes our relationships, you're in the right place. I'm Joni Brennan, president of the DIAC, and I'll be your host. In this episode of Trust Talks and Digital Dives, we explore the critical need for modernizing lawyer-client identity verification processes within the legal ecosystem. Our guests share perspectives from law societies, from Treefort Technologies, and from Vaultie. They delve into the challenges and opportunities presented by digital transformation in legal practices. We discuss the impact of relaxed requirements that took place during the pandemic and the principles guiding future-proofing and modernization efforts, and particularly those design characteristics legal professionals should look for in client ID verification providers. Join us as we uncover how digital services can enhance the lawyer-client relationship and the future of digital identity verification in the legal sector. Let's dive into digital trust in law societies and client ID. Welcome, everyone. We have a fantastic discussion today lined up, and we've got three great guests, and I'm going to have them introduce themselves to the listeners. What's interesting about this conversation, for me at least as well, is that each of our speakers today do come from a different stakeholder perspective on this space, and each of them reached, I would say, the same sort of intersection, which is around the essential need for strong client identification and what that means for trust and to fight fraud. So we'll hear from each of our guests today, and we'll hear their particular views and set a little bit of the stage and hear what's important and why this matters for our ecosystem. So I'll start today with Phil. Phil, would you please introduce yourself to the listeners, why this space is important for you, and also a little bit on the role of jurisdictional law societies that they play as regulators and the role of the Federation of Law Societies as well. Thanks.
Sure. Thanks, Joni. So I'm Phil Brown. I am not with the Federation of Law Societies of Canada. I'm with the Law Society of Ontario. I'm acting director of practice supports and resources. My group answers questions with the practice management helpline, anything related to rules or bylaws. We also maintain a number of resources, which probably brings me here. We answer about 10,000 calls a year. We have resources on anything regarding real estate, virtually anything, the anti-money laundering rules, and so on. We also participate in CPD programs as subject matter experts. We have 2 free programs that we've done in the last year on things like anti-money laundering and client ID and verification. The Federation of Law Societies, which, as I've said, which I'm sort of part of peripherally, is a national organization that represents 14 different law societies in Canada. Their mandate is to regulate the legal profession in the public interest, and the local law societies, of course, pick that up and do that. As a group, they share and collaborate and engage in collective action and decision-making for all of the law societies. They set the model standards for the national guidelines, which are expressed in the model rules and the model anti-money laundering rules. And then the law societies locally implement those rules for their own regulation. The Federation is an info sharing hub. It's a hub for collaboration and also a national voice for all of the law societies. And then the law societies acting on their own jurisdictionally deal with the public interest, setting the standards for for admission to the bar, auditing and monitoring licensees, and also, of course, anti-money laundering, auditing and monitoring source of funds and trust funds, things like that.
Fascinating. So I'm looking forward to the discussion and building on that groundwork that you laid, Phil. Thanks so much. I'm going to pass over to Jay. Jay, would you introduce yourself and Share with the audience and the listeners the need that Treefort, your organization, saw for digital identification in the legal ecosystem, and how that's also tied in with your journey to become the chief legal officer at a digital identity verification focused organization.
Sure, happy to do it. It's good to see you, Joni. So the story actually starts back in 1998 when I articled at an Edmonton-based law firm called Witten LLP. I was with Witten for 23 years, and I was a solicitor, but my practice was mainly involved commercial lending work. So I acted for banks on commercial loans. And really how I started on this journey, Joni, was I wanted to grow my practice. I wanted to become more profitable. I wanted to get more billings. And I said to myself, how am I going to do that? Because it's a very competitive space. There's a number of lawyers in Edmonton that do exceptionally good work on the commercial lending side, acting for banks. They're hard to get as clients. So I said, well, one thing I could do is try to improve my service offering, and one way I thought of doing that is, a lot of my clients who are doing commercial loans are business people who travel a lot. And for me to meet with them to sign a mortgage when they happen to be in Toronto or Houston or Dubai, we can do it, but it creates a lot of friction, creates a lot of expense, and sometimes it causes us to miss deadlines. So I said to myself, there has to be a way that I can meet with my clients virtually to sign documents like a mortgage. I mean, we've got Zoom, we've got DocuSign, what's the problem? So asking that question, which I probably did that in about 2017, started me on this journey. And I quickly realized how incredibly complicated the answer to that question was. One of the things that I quickly realized that I would need to do if I wanted to meet with my clients virtually was to make sure that I was complying with the Law Society of Alberta's client ID rules. So I dug into them and tried to understand them. And what I discovered is I learned a little bit about the history of the rules. But really, the thing is that lawyers, at least in Alberta, the way we all verified the identity of our clients was meeting with them in person and holding the ID in their hand and looking at it, making sure it wasn't expired. But there's these other methods that you can use. And I said, what's this? And how does this work? And then one of the first things I did is I contacted the Law Society of Alberta and I said, listen, I'm thinking of doing this. We want to do this by the book. What do you think of this idea? And that started a partnership we had with the Law Society of Alberta because they said, oh, we've never done this before either. We're not aware of anybody doing this. This is interesting. So we started working with them. Then what happened was we actually created a company called Treefort Technologies Incorporated. And that is the vehicle that we offer that identity verification service through. In 2021, Stewart Title, one of the big title insurance companies, purchased a controlling interest in our company because what we discovered is that little IDV widget we built had value as a fraud prevention tool. So a little bit of a departure from the original vision, but that's why Stewart Title bought us and why the other title insurance companies interact with us is because the tool we've developed helps them prevent fraud. So that happened in July of 2021. I then left private practice and became the chief legal officer of Treefort Technologies in September of 2021. And since then, we've been building out the product and bringing it to market.
Fascinating. It's interesting to hear, as we go forward, I'm thinking about the fabric of relationships between these organizations and what that means in our society. So really appreciate that introduction, Jay. Thank you. I'm going to hand over to you, Meyer. So would you introduce yourself and explain what Vaultie saw in the space regarding the need in digital?
Yeah, hi. Thanks, Joni, for the introduction. And Phil and Jay, it's great to see you guys again. My name is Meyer Mechanic, and I started Vaultie about 5 years ago. We allow lawyers, banks, and governments to trust their clients and the documents that their clients produce from other lawyers, banks, and governments. So they can do both their identity verification and have identity-linked, decentrally traceable documents. So they can prove where their origins were, that there's a digital original copy, and that nothing has changed since. I got my start in KYC when I was 16 years old. I was working at a stockbroker's office, and when a new client would come in, you would literally have to photograph their driver's license, take it to a photocopier, just run it over. You'd have to make sure the lighting was just perfect, and then stick it in the file, and it would sort of sit there for a really long period of time. And the way we authenticate people has always been really interesting to me. And when I had taken that route, I had gone down the finance route for a little bit, and on my way out, somebody had presented a document to me that they had said I had signed. And it was a DocuSigned copy of this document, and I didn't remember signing it for the life of me. I had no recollection. Now, it turns out I did sign it, but that got me really wondering as to sort of like, how does a digital signature work? What really plays there? And at the time, and what was sort of written into our codes in Canada was that any digital marking could be considered a digital signature. If I did something in paint, it was legitimate. So there wasn't trackability. It was really difficult to prove who actually signed what you're sending them. And I started thinking about what would need to be true to make a better signature, and if there would be an opportunity for things that we couldn't sign digitally. At the time, still in some cases, we can't do our wills digitally, although I know that there are some provinces that are working on that right now. There were a whole bunch of other places that required wet signatures simply because we didn't have the digital signature strong enough to do it. So we started sitting down and deriving what would need to be true to really make this ironclad, to really know that the physical person signed a digital document. And that came down to verification. It came down to traceability. So being able to trace back to a document and the verification, so biometrics, which meant that we needed credentials. And it came down to data privacy and data control. So the ability for the client to be able to control the documents that they have, choose who they share it with, when they share it with, and go from there. And we built Vaultie out of that. Our first product that we kind of launched was that exact digital signature, right? We would do your identity verification when you started, prove exactly who the person said they were. And then every time somebody signed a document, we would take another selfie using a reusable credential to be able to prove that it was the same person, track everything on a chain. And the use case that we were really looking at was, in some cases, it's you walk a document into your lawyers and then you're going to take that document to a bank. How does the bank know that what the lawyer put down was the real deal? How do they know that it hasn't changed hands since that person walked out? In that same vein, it was also then, how do I verify the authenticity of events that happened when I wasn't in the room? So that came into things like wills. If you were to technically sign a will on Vaultie, not that that's legal right now in most provinces, not only could I have an original copy because it's linked to a blockchain, but I could also prove 10, 15 years down the road that there wasn't an additional copy of the will ever produced, that the person who had signed it was of sound mind and competence at the time, that the witnesses were all there in person, signed it live. So it really sort of gained its legs there. We started selling that, and then as the pandemic sort of really started picking things up, financial fraud increased 159% in each year during the pandemic. There was $530 million in general fraud losses. I think another 250 million. I think I got that number from Jay, from the mortgage title insurers that they lost. So we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars lost. And as that came and the law societies started moving towards identity verification, Vaultie started evolving as well, and we sort of separated out our traditional identity verification into its own piece, and now offer that as well. And then today we've got 700 law firms on board, and they're starting to build the company out from there.
Cool. So I think I heard a few connection points there in terms of, really thinking about these types of transactions as part of the fabric of trust in our society, of public trust. And as we see more fraud happening, that reduces the public's trust in knowing what they're seeing is real, and that they can have faith in the transactions that they're making. So let's go back to, I heard a few things too, Jay shared around kind of the newness or the novelty of, hey, let's use the technology we have to, can we use technology to underpin what we're doing? I heard a little bit about that with you as well, Meyer. And then also, how do we do a digital identity verification and do it by the book? So I want to go back to Phil, and I want to now lay a bit of groundwork for the listeners who, so they can understand there are client identity verification rules. But I don't know that those rules, initially or have gone into the digital part of it, like the kinds of technologies and things of that nature. So could you give us a little bit of background around, the rules themselves? So is there a relationship with FINTRAC or not? FINTRAC, our financial regulatory body, and kind of what's been the strategy that you've participated in as with your own, the Law Society of Ontario and through the Federation around documentation of these kinds of rules?
Sure. So I'll try to make the history brief. But FINTRAC, which deals with proceeds of crime and terrorist financing, came along back in 2000 and decided that anyone who's doing these financial transactions needs to collect detailed information. The act created a list of people who had to comply with the statute on any transactions that were more than, I think, $3,000 or more. And of course, who ends up on this list but lawyers included in this list of persons who had to keep detailed records. And part of the act included things like warrantless searches and things like that. So the Federation of Law Societies immediately challenged these provisions as they related to lawyers, and there were injunctions which prevented the enforcement of the provisions until the case was heard. 2015, Supreme Court of Canada, in a decision, basically held that the lawyer's duty of loyalty included that duty of commitment to the client's cause, and requiring lawyers to report the state of their client's transactions violated that duty. So at that point in time, since we weren't going to be subject to that statute, the Federation started working on various rules so that we could be within the same regime, but without having being subject to warrantless searches and having to turn over information. So they worked on know your client requirements, which Meyer referenced. And this was all updated in 2018 to deal with restricting the use of trust accounts, limiting the amount of cash lawyers could take. There is, as a result of all that, a joint working group with the Federation of Law Societies and the federal government to collaborate on things like terrorist financing and anti-money laundering. That has been on the go. And of course, the Federation has also developed a number of resources which are on the website. So that's a little bit about the background as to how we got to there. And then, of course, I'm sure we'll talk about it in a few minutes. The pandemic in 2020 adjusted everyone's reference points as well.
So if I were, I think Jay mentioned, typically how it's been done, this verification is you present an identity credential, a document, a card, you present this in person to a lawyer. So what changed with the pandemic? Now we know we couldn't do things in person, so we know that. But how did that affect the ability for lawyers to continue to perform their role in public trust and for people to be able to transact, to keep our economy and our society going? So what changed for lawyers, and how did the Federation and the law societies respond to that?
March 2020, at bylaw 7.1, which was our bylaw in terms of ID and verification and so on, the only means of dealing with the client and verifying the client's identity was either meeting them in person or having an agent meet them in person. So that was another workaround. If your client was physically in Saskatchewan and you were a lawyer in Toronto, the only way to, if you had to verify the ID, the only way you could do it would be by having someone attend with them as an agent on your behalf to have a look at their ID and compare it to the person and say, yeah, that's him or her. So when the lockdown happened, obviously that was in March 2020, that was kind of the end of face-to-face meetings. I know a lot of people scrambled and had plexiglass put up in their offices. They were meeting people outdoors and things like that. But obviously something had to be done. Video conferencing with clients became a necessity. We provided some best practice guidelines at the time as to how to minimize risk of fraud and illegal conduct as best we could given the circumstances. People were meeting by video, holding up ID, saying, hey, look, this is me. Compare my tiny little picture on my driver's license with the face you're seeing. So in 2022, when I say we, I mean the Law Society of Ontario, introduced a couple of new methods of verification, which did not require meeting in person, and that was the credit file method and the dual process method. You could still use an agent as well to meet in person. And we extended that temporary measures that we put in place for virtual verification to December 2023. And then, as Meyer mentioned, and Jay's aware, fraud is on the increase during this period. Stats Can showed that there have been 150,000 cases of fraud reported to the police in 2022, which was more than double the highest ever available data on frauds. So, we had to acknowledge that delicate balance in putting in some safeguards, but still protecting the public and facilitating access to justice and all those other things that would allow lawyers to continue to meet with clients virtually, but take steps to ensure that they weren't inadvertently facilitating fraud or other illegal conduct. So the bylaw changes in January 2024, and if lawyers are choosing to verify their client virtually, they can do so with technology now to authenticate the document and ensure that the client is who they say they are, and the documentation they're using has been authenticated as well. Still, the other options are available, and there's a number of them. But the impact of removing those relaxed standards that we did have, we mitigate risk, obviously, and there's that continuity in service delivery. So, there's the flexibility to continue to meet virtually with clients, and a lot of licensees have adopted that approach. There are people who closed physical offices and only meet virtually now. But they've really, because of that transition to a remote practice, having that ability to use this kind of technology is now pervasive. It's a convenience. It's great for things like access to justice, people who wouldn't be able to go and visit a lawyer in person. And even these days, if you renew your Costco membership, they use an ID verification process. And we're talking about a $65 membership. So, if Costco is worried about that, lawyers should be very concerned about $1 million transactions, and the use of authentication technology, I think, is a huge advance.
I got my citizenship during the pandemic lockdown days, and so I held a permanent resident card up in front of the immigration commissioner, in front of the person in the judge's outfit who performs the ceremony, right? So I think we were doing the best that we could as a society during that time, knowing that we still needed to move forward. But we know that this is always going to create an opportunity. While the majority of people are not doing fraud, the fraudsters are going to find those opportunities, and they're going to look for ways to grow there. So it's commendable, the actions that you did take as a community through that period. And I also like, Phil, that you used the word transition, because I think that it is very much in the move from non-digital to digital, or non-digital plus the addition of digital, is a transition. It's not often it's not a flip of a switch. even though I think a lot of us flipped of a switch to using video conferencing a lot more. And so some things did flip the switch in the pandemic. But I'd like to go over to you, Jay, and talk about, could you tell us a bit about where have been the challenges for lawyers in being slow to adopt this kind of technology? And then also, could you share some of the success stories and kind of where this is actually, working out? And so we have evidence of real progress here.
Before I get into answering your question specifically, I just wanted to build on what Phil said a little bit, because some people listening to this might go, why do we care about the lawyers? And the reason is because when it comes to doing transactions in Canada, especially real estate transactions, lawyers are at the very center. If you think about a typical real estate transaction, the person might deal with a mortgage broker. The mortgage broker collects some information, gives it to a bank. The bank approves you. Then you go and deal with the real estate agent. You see some houses. Then you deal with the lawyer or a notary in Quebec or BC. And then you deal with the title insurance company. In that whole chain of events, it's almost typical that it's the lawyer who's verifying the identity of the individual. Quite often, the mortgage broker never meets the people in person. The lender doesn't ever meet them. Now, the real estate agents meet them, but to be quite honest, they rely on the lawyers to verify the identity. So the reason why we're talking about lawyers today is because lawyers are at the very center of ID verification in Canada, in my view. So coming back to, this is my perspective on why there's a little bit slow to adopt and then some of the success. My perspective is that what lawyers sell is certainty. So if you hire me to close a house purchase and you want your keys this Friday, the result that I'm giving you, the deliverable, is you getting the keys on Friday. And so if I have done a real estate transaction the same way 1,000 times, and I know that it produces that result for my client, I don't want to change that. I don't want to introduce something new that could potentially result in me not delivering that to my client. So it's not that lawyers are stupid. It's not that lawyers resist actually adoption of new things, but what they're focused on is producing the result for their clients. And sometimes trying new things, new processes can create some uncertainty about whether you can produce those results. So starting this whole digital ID journey, from my perspective, that was the first big barrier where lawyers said, hey, what I'm doing works. And they're not wrong. And they'll say it's worked for 20 years and they're not wrong. And they'll say, I can get the client's keys to them on Friday. And that's what they were doing. So really, again, it's the pandemic that really shook things up, in my view, because it forced people to adopt new things, open their minds. It forced them to do video conferencing and look at the other client ID methods. So it shook things up. And then to Phil's point, what we've experienced with our lawyer clients is a lot of them said, hey, you know what? This is pretty cool. Because especially in Ontario, what it allowed lawyers to do, and especially in the real estate space, was expand their client catch basin. Because previously, if you were a lawyer in Mississauga, typically your catch basin for clients was in what, I don't know, say 30-kilometer radius of Mississauga, where people could drive into your office. But now, if you're doing virtual transactions, you could do a deal in Ottawa or Sault Ste. Marie or Thunder Bay. So it gave lawyers the opportunity to expand their practices. So that was one motivation. The other thing is, and this is unquestioned, is clients like it. Because the other thing with lawyers is we are service providers. We provide a service in a very competitive space. So we have to do everything we can to give the clients a good experience. And if the clients can go and meet with their lawyers on their lunch break when they happen to be, let's say the wife is in downtown Toronto and the husband's up in Barrie on a contracting job, and they can meet on their lunch breaks as opposed to having to take a half a day off of work, travel into an office. So again, just to recap a little bit, the big friction was the resistance to change. The pandemic shook things up. That created the opportunity for lawyers to say, there's opportunities here, things we like. So to come to the last part of your question, Joni, what we're seeing is a dramatic uptick in the use of digital ID tools and the completions of transactions digitally. So just for basis of comparison, remember Phil said that in Ontario, the rules changed on January 1st, 2024. And what that means is they retired the COVID emergency measures. For our business, what we had is we had about 3,600 transactions across Canada, but primarily in Ontario in December of 2023. In January, we shot up to 8,100 and almost exclusively due to the increase in Ontario. And in April, we broke 13,000, almost 14,000 transactions. So again, not that ours is the only product out there. Meyer might have had a similar experience, but making the point that what we're seeing now is a dramatic increase in the use of these technologies by lawyers. And what we're hearing from clients is they're getting a better experience. And perhaps most importantly, from my perspective, what we're hearing directly from the title insurance companies is that they're seeing a drop in the number of fraud claims, mortgage fraud and title frauds, as a result of lawyers using ID verification technologies like Vaultie and like Treefort.
Something that I heard as well, certainly the uncertainty is there. And when you talked, I think it really resonates when you talked about lawyers are about buying certainty. You know, it's about investing in repeatable experience and knowing what you're going to get out of it. And I often think about that aspect as well as in being de-risking. Lawyers are risk averse in their nature, and clients also go to lawyers to de-risk to make sure they're going by the book and that they have accountability for the transactions that they're doing. So really important points. And I was going to ask you about how are people feeling using these solutions? And you jumped into that, which is great, which is it has to be a delightful experience, because if it's terrible, people won't do it.
Yes. Well, but I'll jump in there just for a second, Joni, because to be clear, introducing these new steps does introduce friction into the system. So this isn't completely rainbows and unicorns. There are people who get frustrated because there's another step. There's people who can't get their phone to work right. So I don't want to paint the picture for the people who are listening to this podcast that this is like a silver bullet that solves everything. But in my view, the positive benefits for stopping fraud and the experience far outweigh those new little negatives of introducing friction into the process.
One would think that friction would reduce over time. There's certainly a bit of a learning curve on this. And then if you compare the friction of needing to fly or drive or take a train somewhere to do a transaction versus being able to do it, from the convenience where and when you want to do it. Certainly there's some trade-offs there, but very important point though, to verify trust requires some degree of friction along with it. Meyer, I saw that you might want to chime in.
Yeah, I wanted to build on what Jay was talking about there, because the benefits that the users are seeing are vast. There've definitely been a huge chunk of it. And one of the places where we get blinded when we talk about friction is as we see more and more and more usage, we've also doubled since July of last year, every month on transaction use. So Jay's right in the ballpark there. But as you see more and more transactions, we find that we're getting more and more of that friction coming through our intercom systems or our customer service systems, but not in comparison to how much that's grown. So there's still that friction, and the majority of people still love it. But I know as Treefort's getting better, as we're getting better, I think people are having less and less friction. You're still going to have to walk, an 85-year-old who's purchasing their retirement home or their final home through how to take a selfie and how to upload things. Those parts aren't going to go away. But on the whole, these processes are liked more by clients because they're faster and more efficient, liked more by the lawyers who are using them because they're faster and they're more efficient, and they are reducing fraud, right? I mean, just yesterday, we talked about the Toronto Police Department, which laid 102 charges on 12 arrests, having all caught fake IDs with Project Deja Vu. And that's all stuff that, the identity verification providers in this country have helped with, that and FinTrack and a few others. So we're starting to see the results of those successes, and it's only been 2 or 3 months. sorry, 4 months, I guess, since the law study brought this in, but we're already starting to see that. We're starting to see that people prefer these options. And this isn't really just where it starts, because Jay said this earlier, and he's right, where Jay says that they're the center, lawyers are the center of identity. We call them the conduits of trust where we're here, which is as we start talking about the other big things like open banking, which we know is now coming, when we start talking about other transactions, when we go out of real estate, when we start talking about the relationship between law and insurance, when you want to talk about P&C, when we start talking about law and family, when you're talking about divorces, all of these places still require identity at its core to be able to interact with the other side. So there's been so many other use cases where you're watching the virality come out for here. And it's really interesting to not just see what's happening in real estate, but how that relates to banking, how that's going to relate to property and casualty, how that's going to relate to your end of life wishes. Law really can be the center that kind of moves trust services around the country. And similar things kind of happen in the States too. So
it takes us a little bit back where we started around, there are these common patterns in information verification about a person or just in general, there are these common patterns. And so while you will have areas of specialty constraints for the lawyers regarding what information they can share or not, there will be specialized areas that need to be addressed. However, the majority around patternistic information verification is very reusable in terms of those principles and what we use. So, Jay, did you want to chime in?
So, Joni, what we've talked about so far is we've had Phil do an excellent sort of summary of how the law societies and the Federation of Law Societies fit into this. We've had Meyer talk about lawyers and the lawyer's experience. What I want to talk about is that gap in the middle that DIAC is filling, because this is something that I think is perhaps the biggest deal of everything we'll talk about today. So first of all, with the law societies, as Phil says, they do a really good job of putting materials out for lawyers, saying, here's the rules, and there's education sessions. The Law Society of Ontario did an excellent webinar. I forget when that was, Phil. It was maybe 2022, where they went through and did a whole detailed thing. Law Society of British Columbia has done some things, but there's a problem. The law societies can only go so far in providing advice and guidance to lawyers on the use of digital ID tools. Because the law societies are regulators, they can't, or it's very problematic for them to endorse products. They don't have the expertise to look under the hood and have an informed decision on it, but it also, because they're a regulator, because they have to do things like disciplinary hearings, it would put them in a very awkward spot and perhaps jeopardize their independence if they were to come out and say, hey, everybody, use Treefort because it's awesome. And then something bad happens. So we have a limit. And what happened was, in this whole thing where the pandemic hits, lawyers go, oh, there's this credit file method and there's this selfie ID thing. And what is this dual process and banking verification? And so lawyers wanted to adapt, but they want to follow the rules. And there is an information gap where lawyers might say, credit file method. Okay, well, what does that mean? Okay, do I connect with Equifax? Do I have to get an account? What does matching a name mean? Like, it's actually quite hard. Do you require an exact match? What if you don't match the middle name, but you match the last name? How does this all work? And the law societies really aren't in a good position, in my opinion, to answer those specific questions. So lawyers are kind of stumbling around in the dark. And to your point, Joni, you made earlier, is lawyers are all about de-risking situations. So if they don't understand something perfectly, they will revert back to the things they know work, like in-person meetings where you're looking at an ID. And this is where I think DIAC has come in and done an excellent job of filling that information void. For the people on this call who aren't familiar, DIAC is the source of truth and information on digital identity in Canada. It's a not-for-profit, has governments, private sectors, everybody's involved in contributing to this thing. And what DIAC is doing is, first of all, is created a directory that lawyers can go to get information about digital ID products. And there's a very specific questionnaire that companies have to fill, specifically designed around the government issued ID method, the credit file method, and the dual process method. And what we're working on now with DIAC is developing a law society profile, where what we're going to do is we have a list of criteria and we're going to answer the question, what do you have to do exactly to satisfy the requirements of the credit file method? That's a work in progress, but the idea would be the great to by this fall we will have this detailed questionnaire where when somebody says, Jay, does your company satisfy the Law Society of Ontario's credit file method requirements? We can say yes. And this is because we know that we've got a vol law certification through the DIAC. So, Joni, I just wanted to explain there's this information gap, and DIAC is really moving in to fill it, and I'm super excited about it.
It's an important point around impartiality, neutrality, and independence of regulators. And it's a natural place where DIAC, as a nonprofit who's technology neutral and also impartial, has set a set of requirements that services can be verified against so that they can prove to a qualified information security auditor that they have met and mitigated risk along with their service aligned with the types of transactions their service is trying to do. So it's all a very part of this ecosystem is about removing complexity from the endpoint, and whether that's a lawyer choosing a product or a person deciding if it's a transaction they want to do. We're trying to do the hard work to remove the complexity from that end user. Phil, did you want to chime in?
Yeah, no, I just wanted to say first off that I'm sure both Jay and Meyer are very nice guys, but I can't comment on their companies. In all seriousness, though, we do defer to DIAC and other areas as well, because we get calls every day. Can I use Clio? Can I use Practice Panther? Can I use MyCase? And there are just too many different tech packages out there that for us to suggest one might be preferable over another would be irresponsible of us, because we just don't have the people on the ground who could examine and stay up to date on every technology out there. But we do have a tech resource center now on our website. So, if Treefort or Vaultie have how-to videos or introductory things, they're showcased on our tech resource center. And I know I've spoken to Meyer and Jay both about stuff like that. So, lawyers can get up to speed and go directly to the source to have a look at some of this stuff. But it would be, as the regulator, it's extremely difficult for us to say, hey, this is a great product, you can use this. But we can certainly tell them that, certain products do meet the needs. I can also say we get questions about, hey, it costs me X number of dollars to do a Vaultie match or a Treefort authentication. Can I pass that cost on to the client? And we do have FAQs on our website to say, hey, if it's a straight line disbursement that you can relate back to this charge, then yes, you could charge it to the client.
Yeah, a lot of details in there, and certainly a lot of nuance. I think something that we with DIAC have a bit in common with the regulators too is we can't predict every single technology, and there are many different methodologies that can be used. And what's important is that by whether through a single methodology or through multiples of methodologies, that you meet the same bar of trust, that you meet the same bar of assurance, and that the outcome is trustworthy. So it's a real honor for me to work with so many experts in the space to come to those baselines and what they should look like, and those neutral criteria that auditors can then go measure as part of their expertise as auditors. So look, it's a fascinating discussion. I had no thought that we weren't going to be able to fill our time for our episode. I would love to leave off with, I think we've set some of the groundwork, shared who you are and why this is important for you, and more importantly, why this is important for people in our society and our economy. As we wrap up today, I appreciate that we had the opportunity to talk about the transition, about addition of digital. So as we close the conversation today, I'd like to do a round with each of you on if you could leave some actionable advice for the listener who might want to get involved or who is supportive or maybe has concerns or questions. If you have some actionable advice for the listener, could you share one piece of advice for the listeners today? Go ahead, Jay.
I'll,
Meyer, you're up. Go for it.
sorry about that, Jay.
No.
Well, first I'll just link back to Phil quickly and do a shameless plug for both Jay and I. You can see Vaultie and Treefort training materials on the Verification Tools website of the Law Society of Ontario, as well as a couple of the other law societies, as well as a few other companies. So if you want to check those out, feel free. They're both great. In terms of stuff that you can do now, I think paying attention to the Law Society profile that's being worked on at the DIAC is going to be really important for lawyers going forward. One of the really interesting things, and we didn't get a lot of time to talk about it today, is how different lawyers' needs in identity verification are from the older sort of uses of identity verification that banks and governments have kind of already done. Most of the lawyers are also practitioners, so it's a very different type of product. So paying attention to the Law Society profile, getting active if you want to get involved in a committee on that or ask questions. I know Jay's leading it, so he's going to be awesome on that. If you want to get educated on these things as well, every one of the law societies has an FAQ right now, as well, both of our companies, and you can check us out anywhere else.
To note, we do always do public reviews on these types of pieces of work that go out, so anyone is welcome to comment. I will ask the group we'll have your general links up in the show notes, but please, send us any direct references that you'd like us to make. I feel like, Jay, you were kind of queuing up next.
One thing I would like to say to the lawyers that are listening to this is to remember that digital ID tools are just one of the tools that are in your toolkit. You're not required to use them on every transaction. There will be a number of transactions where it's appropriate for you to meet with your clients in person and verify their identity by looking at their hard ID. That is still allowed under the rules. So I don't want there to be a misconception that you must do this all the time. But my prediction is, and you can hold me to task on this, Joni, that within 24 months, lawyers across Canada will be required to verify the identity of every person that they're working with on a real estate transaction. And because of this, even if I'm wrong, it's still going to be the majority. I would say the one action item for lawyers is to take the time, look at the resources on the client ID rules that are put out by the law societies like the Law Society of Ontario, educate yourself on what tools are available and which ones are the right fit for you. Start using them in appropriate circumstances so that you're very well prepared if my prediction is right and it becomes mandatory.
Thank you, Jay. Thanks so much. Phil, I'll hand over to you for the last bit of advice for the listeners.
Sure, I'll be quick. I just want to say the Federation of Law Societies does have a standing group on anti-money laundering, and they're always reviewing changes to rules, requirements, new technology that's relevant to the practice of law and AML. So have a look at the Federation of Law Societies website. There's a lot of resources there. The Law Society of Ontario has a ton of resources. I know Alberta and BC also have a ton of resources, so don't be limited to your particular province if you don't find something you want. And as well, feel free to contact the Practice Management Helpline. If we don't have an answer, we can direct you to the right place. Even if it's something substantive or procedural, we have a coach and advisor network we can connect licensees with as well, and they can help you out with something procedural.
Thank you, Phil. I want to thank each of you for joining our conversation today. I want to thank each of you and your organizations for the commitment and the work that you do on very complicated topics to support the trust fabric of our society and our economy. I want to let the listeners know as well that this is a very small sample of the many organizations and people who are working on these difficult topics to try to make the world a safer and better and privacy respecting space for all of you. And I want to thank the listeners for joining in with us today. So we'll have show notes up and we'll see how this space evolves in this transition as we work together to keep our society and our economy safe in the transition to adding digital to our tool set.
Thanks, Joni.
That's a wrap for today's episode of Trust Talks and Digital Dives. Your support means the world to us. If you found today's conversation insightful, subscribe so you'll never miss an episode. Help us spread the word by sharing Trust Talks and Digital Dives in your networks. So until next time, keep exploring and keep delving into the world of digital trust.